Hello and welcome everyone, and welcome to Bar and Bench's interview series. Today we all woke up to the news of Twitter having lost its legal protection in India from prosecution over users' posts because of its failure to comply with the new IT rules 2021. Government sources had indicated to the news agencies who carried the report that a case was filed in Uttar Pradesh against the social media giant with tweets that the police say attempted to incite communal trouble. Now, what does it exactly mean to lose the legal shield in India for a social media company? There has been a lot of confusion over social media and among the general public today that Twitter is an intermediary and can, after today, Twitter lose its intermediary status. So to dissect all of this, today we have with us Mr. Krishnesh Bapat. He is the Center for Communication Governance Digital Rights Fellow at the Internet Freedom Foundation and is also a part of the litigation team at the Internet Freedom Foundation. Thanks for being with us, Krishnesh. Hope you are keeping safe in this pandemic. Beginning the interview, our first question is, what is this entire report today about Twitter losing its legal status or shield in India?
So these reports are derived from the 2021 intermediary guidelines,
right.
Rule 7 of which states that intermediaries may lose their safe harbor provided under Section 79 of the IT Act if they do not comply with the rules. Now, the reports are that Twitter has not complied with these rules, and hence it's not an intermediary anymore. According to us, this is not a correct assessment of the law. According to the law, intermediary is a technical qualification, and it's not a registration which can be given and taken. Intermediary, simply put, is a conduit, which basically allows which allows two people to have a conversation between each other without interfering itself. So WhatsApp is an intermediary, Facebook is an intermediary, Twitter is an intermediary. The reports which states that Twitter has lost its intermediary status are incorrect. They are not based on a correct understanding of the Information Technology Act.
So how do you think this entire report started, or these conversations started about Twitter losing its intermediary status?
So these IT rules 2021 have been notified under the Information Technology Act. They were first released in February, and the division of it is that Part 2 of the IT rules deal with social media, and Part 3 deals with OTT platforms and digital news media. Now, under Part 2, there are separate regulations for social media intermediaries and significant social media intermediaries. Twitter, of course, is a significant social media intermediary because it has more than 50 lakh users. Now, Rule 4, which governs significant social media intermediaries, kicked in on 25th of May. As a result of which, 25th of May was the deadline till which they could have complied with the significant social media intermediary rules. And that's why this has become a controversy, so to speak, right now, because the question is whether Twitter has complied with these rules or not, which, of course, is a factual question.
You know, these rules were challenged in the Madras High Court by T.M. Krishna, and they were assailed on several grounds of violating right to privacy, etc. If you could just throw in some light as to how the IT rules 2021 is connected to today's issue of, this entire report of Twitter losing its legal status, etc., which essentially, as you're calling, is misreported.
Multiple petitions have been filed throughout the country challenging the constitutionality of IT rules 2021, including the one which you are referring to by Mr. T.M. Krishna. Internet Freedom Foundation has provided legal assistance to the petition filed by Mr. T.M. Krishna and to another one filed by Live Law in Kerala High Court. Broadly speaking, the intermediary rules, as I mentioned earlier, regulate social media and digital news media. Now, both of these are, now the regulation itself derives its origin to Section 79 of the Information Technology Act, which provides a safe harbor to social media intermediaries. Simply put, the safe harbor basically says that a social media intermediary such as Twitter or Facebook cannot be held liable for content posted by someone else. And that's understandable because Twitter and Facebook have had no inputs in that content. Only the person who has put that content can be held liable for that content. Now,
Okay.
what IT rules do is that they set out certain guidelines which Twitter and Facebook have to follow. And if Twitter and Facebook or other such entities do not follow such guidelines, they will be liable to criminal prosecution. Now, this criminal prosecution will only take place when someone, let's say, uploads content which is unlawful. Then an FIR is filed against that person saying that this content is unlawful. And that FIR can also take Twitter along. Now, the question before the court, that lower court where these proceedings will go on, will be whether Twitter has complied with the obligations listed in IT Rules 2021. Twitter can say that we have complied and hence we have safe harbor, so we cannot get prosecuted. The prosecution, on the other hand, might very well argue that Twitter has not complied with these rules and hence it should also get prosecuted. Just like the person who has authored the post will get prosecuted. And that's the link between IT Rules 2021 and Information Technology Act and the current controversy which is going on.
Okay. Drawing your attention to what Law Minister Ravi Shankar Prasad said today. He essentially said that if any foreign entity believes that they can portray itself as the flag bearer of free speech in India to excuse itself from complying with the law of the land, such attempts are misplaced. Now, my question to you, Krishnesh, is can Twitter choose not to comply with a local law in place since it's a foreign entity? And if you can just explain it for our lay users, how does Twitter decide, which regulation it follows and which regulation, it can avoid following? Though we know that Twitter has written his last communication on June 7 to the Ministry or to the Information and Technology saying that, they need some more time. But how far can they go around this new IT rules? Are they waiting for the IT rules to be struck down by the court of law or be stayed? That's why they're not complying. Or also, if you could just shed some light on what are the dangers that Twitter is essentially anticipating by complying to the IT rules, if any?
So as far as I know, Twitter, and something which you mentioned as well, Twitter has made a public commitment that they are going to comply with IT rules. In my knowledge, there is also a petition before Delhi High Court challenging Twitter's non-compliance with IT rules and asking the court to direct Twitter to comply with these rules. In that petition also, Twitter has stated, in those court proceedings also, Twitter has stated that they are going to comply. Now going to the other part of your question on whether these rules need to be followed. Most definitely. And the law minister is correct when he says that this is the law of the land as of now and this needs to be complied with. So Twitter does have an obligation to comply with Rule 4 of the IT rules, which includes, for instance, appointment of a chief compliance officer based in India, appointment of a grievance officer, appointment of a nodal officer. So these are obligations which are imposed upon Twitter through these rules, and Twitter has to comply with those obligations, especially because none of the courts where these rules have been challenged have stayed the implementation of these rules. So there is an obligation on Twitter to comply. Now the question here today really is, what is the consequence of Twitter not complying with these rules? Does Twitter lose its status as an intermediary? And I hinted at an answer to that earlier when I said that Twitter does not automatically lose its status as an intermediary. Whether Twitter has complied or not is itself a factual question, which can be litigated upon before courts. And Twitter may argue that we have in fact complied, because the obligations or the compliances are also multiple. And yes, sorry.
But Krishnesh, if they comply with these IT rules and as we have a limited understanding of it, is there a possibility of Twitter being dragged to the court of law at every, how our criminal justice system works? Since we have the concept of FIRs, we also see, these cases wherein there are multiple FIRs registered in multiple various states of the country. So do we anticipate a similar situation with every tweet that is tweeted? A person may approach the nearest police station and file a FIR against Twitter, and then Twitter coming to the Supreme Court saying that, collate all the FIRs, as we have seen in other cases, whether it be journalist Arnab Goswami or whoever it is. So how are you anticipating this entire situation once, this becomes true, in fact?
Yeah, that's the biggest concern. I think we came across an FIR this morning itself from Ghaziabad where Twitter is alleged as one of the accused.
Yes.
And this is something which we are likely to see if Twitter does not comply with these rules, where whenever someone posts something which is seemingly unlawful on Twitter, not only that person will be taken to court, not only that an FIR will be registered against that person, but also against Twitter. And Twitter will be at the risk of facing criminal prosecution, and also there is a possibility that Twitter or officials of Twitter may get convicted in those proceedings. But again, in those proceedings, the crucial question will be whether Twitter has complied with the IT rules or not.
You know what, that brings me to the next part of my question is, as a lawyer, Krishnesh, if you could just tell our viewers as to what are the kind of defenses that Twitter can take in the court of law when, even if we assume an hypothetical situation that there is a case lodged and a court of law has been called upon to decide if at all Twitter is an intermediary or not. In that situation, what defenses can Twitter take in the court of law?
So at the outset, the first defense they can perhaps take is that if they have appointed compliance officers, they can say that, well, look, we have put in place these officers. Other obligation which the rule imposes on Twitter is that they have to remove any content which the government asks them to remove within 36 hours. And that's a Section 69 order under the IT Act. Now, Twitter in that case can perhaps provide some data to the court saying that, look, whenever we have received any order from the government, we have complied with it. We have looked at the order, we have seen that it's a legally valid order issued by a competent authority. And we complied with this order, and we immediately removed whatever the government asked us to remove. So these are the things which Twitter can argue before court and say that we have been complying with these obligations, and hence we should get the protection of safe harbor.
Yeah, this brings me to the next question. Does the IT Act or IT rules contain any power or process for the grant of revocation of intermediary rules? And if that is so, how does it actually takes place?
It doesn't. So that's the confusion, I think, which is prevalent in the reports across the country today. IT rules or the Information Technology Act does not contain a provision which allows for revocation as a status of as revocation of the status of an intermediary. Intermediary, as I mentioned earlier, is a technical qualification, not something which can be granted or revoked. Twitter is an intermediary and will remain an intermediary until it starts to actively edit tweets which are put on its platform, much like a newspaper does. Newspaper, in that sense, is not an intermediary because it publishes its own material. Twitter doesn't do that. Similarly, like the question of whether Twitter has safe harbor or not under Section 79, that's something which is up for debate.
So, I think you have already answered the question that I was going to ask now, like how, with Section 79 in the backdrop, how does the new IT rules impact this? Do you think this is going to pan out in a wider scenario? Like apart from Twitter, are any other social media companies also in loop for such kind of not compliance with the IT rules, especially Section 79?
Yeah, I think all of the social media intermediaries, especially those who have more than 50 lakh users, because as I mentioned, obligations on them are more onerous than they are for other intermediaries. All of them have to comply with these rules. And if they don't, then they're at similar risk as Twitter is. So there is an urgent need for them to comply with the rules until like a court of law decides that these rules are valid or invalid, or until the government itself decides to revoke these rules.
So this is basically, as I understand, Krishnesh, this is a case-to-case basis kind of an evaluation.
Yes.
When we talk about, like, if suppose today I have an issue with Twitter, with a post on Twitter, and I take it to as an FIR, and then Twitter goes to court, it's just my case that is being heard. There can be another case the next day wherein its intermediary status is called upon questioning before the court. Is there an end to it? Like, what if a court of law decides that Twitter is not an intermediary but a publisher in this case? Mm-hmm. What happens in that scenario?
Most definitely. So Twitter will obviously remain an intermediary until it becomes a publisher like a news agency. If one court of law, let's say the first court of law before whom this question is raised, and Twitter is able to prove that they are an intermediary, that will be something which will also be looked upon by subsequent courts. That look, this is a question which has been answered before. Twitter has proved before that court of law that it is an intermediary which is complying with IT rules 2021. And that's something which will act as law of the land, and Twitter will need not go in multiple proceedings. But that's something which depends on what the prosecution also argues. So, for instance, if subsequently Twitter does not have a chief compliance officer, in that case, the prosecution can again raise this question that look, these guys are not complying with the rules, and they are not, they should not get the protection of Section 79. So it's a question which can arise again later on as well. So Twitter will always have to be mindful that they are complying with these rules.
One question that Krishnesh brings us to is, if whether or not it is an intermediary is decided by the court, does this hamper the current operations of Twitter in our country?
Most definitely it would, because if Twitter, a court of law holds that Twitter is not complying with IT rules, the officers of Twitter in India are liable to get prosecuted and also punished, which of course is a grave threat which they face, which I think pre facto makes them definitely comply with these rules.
Krishnesh, are there any international examples that come to your mind for such a similar situation where a social media company faced a threat of losing their intermediary status, maybe appealed in a higher court of law?
So Section 230 is there in USA, which provides similar safe harbor. I'm not aware of other situations where intermediaries have lost their safe harbor status, but safe harbor is something which is guaranteed to intermediaries generally across countries. India in particular now has imposed certain obligations which companies have to comply with to get that status, something which is not common across jurisdictions, especially the extent to which the obligations we have imposed, the extent to which we have imposed obligations in India with the IT rules.
There's been a lot of debate today, especially on social media, that there is IT rules do not pose any threat to the safe harbor provision which an intermediary has in India. How far that is true, firstly, and secondly, is the safe harbor provision at all at risk if Twitter does not comply with the new IT rules?
So the safe harbor provision in Indian law is Section 79 of the Information Technology Act. It basically says that intermediaries such as Twitter cannot be held liable for information posted by third parties. Now, one of the criteria for having the safe harbor is that they must comply with guidelines which the government issues from time to time.
Okay.
IT Rules 2021 is that guideline which the government has issued. Now, if Twitter does not comply with this guideline, it loses the safe harbor and loses its immunity against prosecution, which may arise because of information posted by third parties.
Okay.
So that's one. Part two of it is that these rules most definitely impact the safe harbor provision because they impose obligations.
Okay.
And these obligations are strenuous, so to speak, because they have a reduced timeline on how long Twitter can take to take down content which the government has asked it to remove. Twitter has to appoint officers in India who have to be residents of India. Twitter has to start using artificial intelligence technology to take down content. So they have to actively start investing in it as a matter because of the Indian law now. So these are provisions which Twitter has to comply with in order to get the safe harbor.
Are there similar kinds of restrictions on such social media companies internationally too? Or it's a one-of-a-kind regulation that we seeing here in India?
So safe harbor is there for social media entities across the world. And social media companies are not typically held responsible for the content they post. IT Rules 2021 are most definitely more onerous than what you see elsewhere in the world. Elsewhere in the world also, there are certain obligations imposed on these platforms to ensure that whatever is happening on these platforms is compliant with the law of the land. But the question really is the extent or how far these IT Rules 2021 go.
Krishnesh, I think that summarizes the entire topic pretty fairly. If you want to add something at your end, because I know Internet Freedom Foundation has been deeply involved with this entire, ever since the IT rules were published and then deliberated upon. Do you think there is still an amount of misinformation that is there in the among the public? Like for instance, today's reports have created a furor over social media, saying people really believe that Twitter has lost its legal shield. So can tomorrow an XYZ person go and file an FIR against Twitter?
Most definitely, an FIR can be filed against Twitter. Even earlier, before these rules came into play, we had seen.
But can they be held criminally liable? I think that is something which everyone wants to know.
The court in that case will determine whether Twitter is complying with the rules or not. If Twitter is complying with the rules, then it will not be held liable. If Twitter isn't complying with the rules, then it will be held liable. And that's the important distinction to maintain here.
So, do you think that this entire report today's and what follows next from here will only put Twitter in a race to comply with the guidelines? What's the I really wanted to understand, Krishnesh, from you, what's the most drastic thing that can happen if Twitter so chooses not to comply with the guidelines?
So the reports today, in my understanding, have jumped the gun a little bit, in the sense that they have already assumed that Twitter does not have safe harbor. The point to be noted here is that it's for the courts to determine whether Twitter has safe harbor or doesn't have safe harbor. Now, the consequence of not having safe harbor is, of course, most definitely drastic. Twitter may face a situation where its officers in India, where its employees in India are prosecuted and perhaps even later on punished. And because of that consequence, Twitter is obviously in a race to comply with the rules. It has been in that race ever since these rules came into play, and especially since May 26th, when the deadline to comply ended. There is already a petition before Delhi High Court on this question exactly, whether Twitter is complying with the rules or not. And we'll see how that petition goes, how Twitter responds now.
The first thing which probably now needs to happen is for Twitter to comply with the guidelines to keep its operations going on in India, and then probably the court of law deciding upon the IT rules. And if at all, the IT rules are in fact struck down, then probably Twitter goes back, to not facing such criminal liability or cases. So basically here the question, as far as I understand, is of safe harbor provision, whether Twitter is able to retain the safe harbor provision or not. And Krishnesh, has the other social media companies like Facebook, WhatsApp, have they all complied with the latest IT rules guidelines? And is only WhatsApp, is only Twitter remaining?
I've also only come across reports which say that these guys have complied, but WhatsApp crucially has challenged the validity of the IT rules itself before Delhi High Court. A few days ago, this was also in news reports. I don't think a hearing before the court has happened yet.
No, it is not.
WhatsApp has stated, I think, therein that they're going to comply with the rules until a court decides to impose a stay on it, or government decides to withdraw these rules.
So that was the question. Can Twitter follow the same path, challenging the IT rules, in fact, and then not following the IT rules till the court of law decides on it?
Most
is it just asking you? Is it a legal strategy in place here not to comply with the IT rules?
I can't speak for Twitter, but apart from that, from the stance before Delhi High Court, it seems that they do want to comply. Their public statements also seem to be that they do want to comply. I think it's really a question of the compliance hasn't happened yet. Yeah. So it hasn't happened in the past few days, but maybe we will see compliance in the next few days. Because Twitter hasn't indicated otherwise. They haven't said that we don't want to follow these rules.
Right. I think these reports also find a place from the earlier reports of social media companies getting banned in India, etc. Mm-hmm. So I think those were also a little off the track reportings that happened at that point of time. Mm-hmm. So following the lineage, probably today's report also joins the same league. But keeping the report aside, one primary concern here indeed is that Twitter can be held criminally liable if they don't follow the IT rules 2021, and that safe harbor is in fact a danger. Is that a right thing? Is that a right thing to say?
Yes, but just a word of caution. Let's wait for the court to decide that. It's not for the
So that happens on an individual basis, individual
happens on the
case
individual
basis.
basis. Yes.
Right, right.
So as of now, there's no gazette notification or an order by the government saying that Twitter is banned in India, or that Twitter does not have safe harbor. Even if there is a notification to that end by the government that Twitter does not have safe harbor, that will again be for the courts to decide whether Twitter
And the
has safe harbor
notification
or
can be
not.
challenged. But as far as we could understand after a discussion with you, is that government per se does not have the right to take away the safe harbor provision from Twitter. It's only the court of law
Yes.
that can do it. So the only thing is that if it does not follow with the IT rules, they will face the action of going to court, and the court will have to then decide whether at all. Section 79 is the savior provision for us to say here.
Yeah, it is the safe harbor provision, and it is extremely crucial in this day and age because you do want these platforms to some extent to act independent of extraneous considerations, to not restrict speech unnecessarily. At the same time, I think everyone here recognizes that there is a need to regulate these platforms,
Right?
Because a lot of misinformation is often spread on these platforms. A lot of trolling happens. A lot of hate speech is there on these platforms. So the question really is, what is the regulation? What is the correct regulation which you can do so that free speech is protected, and at the same time, the other concerns which I mentioned earlier are also taken care of.
Do you think the new IT rules 2021 takes care of the freedom of speech and expression of social media companies, especially for millions of users on it?
So these rules have been challenged precisely on that ground, especially vis-a-vis social media entities, that they have a chilling effect on free speech. And that is primarily because of the kind of things we discussed earlier. These organizations now have to comply with orders of the government or they face criminal prosecution. For example, now they only have 36 hours to remove content when the government asks them to remove certain content. Okay. Now, Twitter in that case cannot do an independent analysis of whether order of the government is legally valid or not. And of course, Twitter is no one to decide the validity of government's order. But Twitter could have at least checked whether the order is coming from a competent authority under Section 69. You can't have a bureaucrat who doesn't have the authority of issuing such orders, sending out these orders to Twitter. But Twitter now has to comply with any order it receives within 36 hours. And if Twitter doesn't do so, then it loses its safe harbor.
Right. So these are the provisions which have primarily been challenged for the court.
IT rules itself, they have been challenged. And
yes. So it all depends upon the outcome as to whether the rules are upheld or struck down for the larger debate to go on. But as of now, Twitter is still not banned. We can all keep using Twitter, and the safe harbor provision can only be probably taken away by the court of law. That's what my summary is from our...
I think that summarizes it perfectly.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Bapat, for clearing the air on so many issues today with us. Hopefully, we have gained some clarity on how Twitter actually stands at a risk of losing its safe harbor provision in India. Thank you for being with us, and hopefully we will connect soon.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell icon.